7:58 p.m. I cracked the heirloom box the way a diver tests cold water with one breath held too long, already rehearsing the glitter I want to see, already promising my mother I've kept everything exactly where she left it. And then the lid sighs open and there is only the hollow shape of what used to be, indentations pressed into velvet like little graves, and a single crooked pawn stub curled in the corner as if it tried to hide from me. Grief is a noisy thing until it isn't. It goes quiet in the body the way power dies in a house, one room at a time, leaving you standing in a doorway you've known all your life with a flashlight made of memory. I am a junior paralegal. I live in exhibits and affidavits and chain of custody forms. I staple truth to paper until it can't wriggle, and still my hands tremble as I lift a stub because it shouldn't exist, and my mother's bracelet should, and the unsteady part of me that is still the daughter and not the legal clerk wants to turn back time rather than turn the paper over. The bracelet was sapphire, ocean blue in a square cut, that made my wrist look steadier than I felt the day she fastened it on me for graduation, whispering, "For luck you earned." The locket was smaller than my thumb and held my baby photo, cheeks like proof that softness once lived here. I used to touch it during exams, during job interviews, during her chemo when the doctor talked too fast. The coin set came from her grandfather. She called it our depression weather, because it had endured a century of hard seasons and taught us that keeping what matters is a skill. These were not assets, they were anchors. I slide my thumb into the empty grooves the way a missing tooth makes your tongue restless, and it hits me that absence has a texture you can recognize blindfolded. Greg, her widower, never my father but the man who watered her peonies and learned to make her coffee the way she liked, the man who has said, "I'm covering bills," so often since the funeral 3 months ago that the phrase now sounds like a prayer he doesn't believe, has been in this room. He said he was looking for old photographs for the thank you notes. He said he was too tired to sort jewelry when I offered. He said a dozen small things that, stacked, feel suddenly like a wall between the truth and me. I look down at the stub. The store ID is circled. The date is last month, not last week, not a frantic mistake, and the name field is blank where any real person would have signed. I hold the paper to the lamp as if heat could tease out a watermark, and instead I catch my reflection thrown back at me from the glass. Jaw tight, eyes rimmed, raw, a woman who sounds like her mother when she says, "No." The disbelief is brief and rude, and then it hardens into something cleaner. Cold anger is not a storm, it's the air after one, visibility sharp enough to cut. I touch the locket chain still pinned to the lid, a thin ghost of what used to hang from it, and then I do the only thing that has ever given me leverage over chaos. I make a file. I photograph the box from 4 angles. I photograph the indentations, the dust footprint where the coin sleeve used to sleep, the minute thread snag on the left hinge. I lay the pawn stub on a clean sheet of printer paper and take close-ups of the ink, the torn corner, the shadow my hand makes because my hands are part of this record too. I label a manila folder with tonight's date and the exact time, 7:58 p.m., and write, Hale Estate, Personal Property, Tax Fee, Potential Conversion in block letters that leave no room for misreading. Greg's voice is in my head, an echo from the kitchen last week. "You make everything a federal case." Maybe I do. Maybe love taught me to keep the family clean, and work taught me how. The investigative focus arrives like a metronome. I open my laptop, pull the template for a property inventory, and start listing what isn't here. I leave space for photos, for receipts, for what I hope is a misunderstanding, but am now prepared to prove is not. My eyes land on the printer. I imagine the future pages that will spill out of it, the photocopies of transactions, the sworn statements, the receipts fanned like a dealer's cut, and I feel my heart slow into that work rhythm that has saved me more than once. I look around the room as if it might confess. The window is cracked, the way Greg leaves it when he smokes on the porch. The dresser drawer, where the spare keys should be, is slightly ajar. A strip of packing tape clings to the box edge, clear but clouded with fingerprints I can't read, and I press it back with a fingertip the way you close the eyes of the dead in movies, a gesture meant for the living. Proof is coming. It always does if you are patient and stubborn, and willing to read your own pain like evidence rather than poetry. The moral high ground doesn't feel noble from up close. It feels like standing on concrete in bare feet because somebody has to. By the time I put the box back in the closet, my anger has a spine and a to-do list, and the smallest relief washes through me. Not because anything is fixed, but because the next step is known, and known is kinder than guessing. I turn toward the desk to print the first page of the inventory, eyes landing on the quiet machine that will soon roar to life when the landline rings, loud as a gavel in an empty courtroom. "You need to see these receipts," a man says when I pick up, voice like traffic at midnight. He's been busy. Fluorescent light made everything look guilty, even me. The metal desk reflected my face in dull tin, while Detective Morris slid a thick, warm stack of paper across the surface and spread it with his palm the way a dealer fans cards before the hand that ruins your night. The carryover from last night buckled behind my ribs, a grief memory that arrived with the sterile smell of toner and old coffee, reminding me of my mother's hospice room and the way machines disguise endings as beeps. I steady myself by touching the empty locket at my throat, feeling the cool edge of the oval where my baby photo should be, and I tried not to flinch at the sound the paper made as it skated under his fingers, a soft rasp like a match being struck. He said he'd called because a routine audit had pinged on repetitive pawn activity tied to my address. And now, with the receipts on the table, the word routine felt like a joke told at the wrong funeral. He began with the top page and spoke the language I live in, dates, amounts, item descriptions, while the disbelief that had carried me through the phone call thinned and hardened into a colder shape. There was the sapphire bracelet sold on a Thursday afternoon for a number that made my jaw ache, and 3 days later repawned at the same shop for less, and a week later shuttled again, as if grief could be converted to cash in installments. There was the locket listed twice, once as gold pendant and once as sentimental keepsake, an insult dressed as clerical precision. There was the Depression-era coin set, parceled out by mint and year, broken like a sentence with its verbs removed. Each line item wore its timestamp like a bruise, and each location, always within a 5-mile radius, suggested convenience rather than emergency, steady hands rather than panic. Morris flipped his red pen and circled a signature that sat under several of the slips, the G trailing off in a hurried flourish I recognized from rent checks and birthday cards, and my throat closed the way a door does when wind slams it from behind. He didn't say Greg's name because he didn't have to, and I tried to keep my voice professional even as something old and soft in me snapped like twine. Then he tapped a different line, not with accusation but with curiosity, and there it was, neat where Greg's was sloppy. K. Renner, a second hand on a clock I hadn't noticed ticking, an additional cadence to the theft. I leaned in, eyes pulled by the printer behind him that kept coughing out more copies, steady as a heart that refuses to break pace for drama, and asked the question I would ask any client: what is the remedy and how fast does it die? He told me the law here is merciless to hesitation. Holding periods expire, auctions snap the trap shut, and once an item crosses that counter into the gray zone of resale, recovery becomes a bargain you don't always win. He didn't glamorize it. He just laid the timer between us and wound it by pointing to the calendar stuck with a thumbtack to the wall. I thought about Greg's kitchen speech: lights, mortgage, dignity, and the way necessity likes to dress up as morality when it needs a better seat in court. Cold anger slid into investigative focus with the click of a mental binder ring, and I asked for copies of everything, even the pages that seemed redundant. Because redundancy is just another word for protection when people start lying. He obliged with the kind of care that makes you trust a stranger. Top right corner stamps with the date and time, initials beside each, a notation about the source pool from the reporting system so chain of custody would hold even if someone tried to shake it later. The proof shock arrived not as a scream, but as silence, a quality of quiet that pressed my palms to the table. Morris flipped 3 receipts in a row, and the pattern leaped up: bracelet on a Thursday, locket on a Tuesday, coins on a Friday, and on the following Monday, a transfer of cash noted by the clerk as settlement, a euphemism so tidy it should have been issued a tie. He set the shop keeps footage for 30 days unless subpoenaed sooner, that he could make that request today if I wanted him to move, and I nodded because movement felt like righteousness wearing shoes. He asked if I had proof of ownership, photos, appraisals, anything notarized, and I told him yes, yes, and yes, hearing my mother's voice in the word, because she had taught me to put dignity on paper before anyone tried to take it off my body. That was the moral high ground, not the empty sanctimony of outrage, but the stubborn labor of documentation, the administrative holiness of a stamp hitting pulp. He clipped the stack, squared it 3 times on the desk the way clerks do when they want the edges to align, and pressed it into my hands. It was heavier than I expected, as if paper can absorb the weight of what it records. Exhausted relief bled at the edges of my steadiness. Not relief that anything was resolved, but relief that the outline of this fight was visible now, that my eyes could move from the printer to the pages, to the man who would sign the subpoena while I called the pawnshop and the court in the same breath. I tucked the stack into my bag like armor and touched the locket again, a reflex I barely noticed, and only then did my phone buzz on the desk and skid a half-inch, shameless as a coin chasing gravity. Greg's text glowed on the screen. "Don't talk to him. He's lying to you." The neon in the window vibrates the way a throat hums before a confession, red script pulsing over a glass case that throws my face back at me where the bracelet should be, and for a second the reflection looks like my mother after chemo, cheeks hollowed by effort and still stubbornly dignified, which is how grief arrives here, uninvited and accurate, sharpening everything I touch. The bell above the door chirps, and the clerk glances up from a ledger that looks older than my paralegal career, and I feel my fingers climb to the soft indent at my collarbone where the locket chain used to leave a small mark by day's end, a reflex that steadies me the way touching the printer lid did last night when I watched Detective Morris fan the receipts into a shape I could fight. I did not come to make a scene, I remind myself. I came to make a record. The clerk, a man with reader glasses perched so low they seemed to study me first, listens as I describe the square-cut sapphires with the tiny nick near the clasp you'd miss unless you loved it, and his eyes flick once to the back room before he nods and says he recognizes what I'm describing, that a bracelet like that came in last month with a locket and a coin sleeve, and if I bring proof of ownership, photos, appraisal, anything with serials, tomorrow morning he can place a hold while they verify. For a breath I am pure disbelief in motion, the kind that makes you imagine you misheard, but the man is already moving toward a monitor bolted above the counter, tapping keys until a frozen frame fills the screen. Grainy, monochrome, timestamp stamped with an exactness that feels personal. The figure leaving the counter wears a hood pulled tight, but posture is an unmistakable signature. Shoulders that round when guilt gets heavy, a right foot that turns out because of an old softball injury, the habitual tilt of someone who learned to make himself medium-sized in doorways. If you've ever waited up for a man who promised he'd be home before the game ended, you know the geometry of his body better than you know your own. I don't say Greg's name. I don't have to. My mouth tastes like the metal of the desk back at the precinct. The clerk flips a laminated flyer toward me with the bored precision of someone who has done this all month, and the bright header makes a joke of my pulse. Unclaimed items auction. 10 days. 10 days is not a lot of time to turn pain into paperwork. 10 days is exactly long enough to measure whether you are who you say you are when you tell the world you'll keep the family clean. I swallow the cold anger that wants to take up space and let it settle into shape, then ask, as if I were talking to a witness, whether the bracelet came in alone. He shrugs and says a woman dropped by too, short hair, medical scrubs, signed on a few slips as K. Renner. And the name crosses the room like a whisper from a bedside I can still smell. Alcohol wipes, lemon hand gel, the harsh sweetness of hope. Kara Renner had held my mother's hand in the final weeks and told me to sleep when the monitor softened. It had sounded like kindness. Now it sounds like a hinge. Investigative focus is a muscle memory in me, and I let it move. I ask permission to photograph the log numbers on the counter ledger, the wall calendar circled in red for the auction date, the interior layout from the front door to the camera angles so my future affidavit can speak in pictures as well as paragraphs. The clerk hesitates, then shrugs again, granting what he doesn't have the energy to deny. I step through the little choreography I know by heart. Wide shot, medium, close. Include clocks where possible. Don't block exits. Keep reflections out of glass when confidentiality matters. And I hear my mother teasing me for turning everything into evidence while I hear my boss in the back of my head praising me for finally doing it for myself. I photograph the flyer, the auction rules, the fee schedule that stings like insult, and when I set my phone down for a moment to give my hand a break, I glance at the counter and see a small stack of printed receipts resting by the register, fanned casually by the clerk as he rifled them, and the sight is so on the nose I almost laugh. The world is ready to hand me proof if I'll stop flinching long enough to ask for it. Proof shock doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet that makes your ears ring with your own heartbeat. The clerk prints a copy of the item intake for me to bring back with my documents. Date stamps the corner, scribbles his initials in the cramped space the form pretends is generous, and slides it across like we're playing cards in a slow bar. I take it, not because a single page wins anything, but because the moral high ground is paved with small, boring steps that liars can't make themselves take. I tell him I'll be back at opening with photos and the appraisal and my mother's will, that I intend to freeze anything connected to our address until a judge says otherwise, and he nods with the weary humanity of a man who has seen versions of this scene with worse endings. By the time I step outside, the day has slipped toward evening, the neon humming behind me like a lie detector that won't shut off. An exhausted relief threads through my anger because at least I can see the road now. I can picture the printer on my desk spitting out the motion to preserve, the exhibits labeled cleanly, the receipts stapled in a square that keeps their corners from fraying. I tuck the intake copy into my bag and lift my eyes and freeze, because across the street, leaning against a parking meter like this is a game we designed together. Greg is watching me, and he is smiling the slow smile men save for times they think they share your secret. He lifts 2 fingers in a salute only I have ever understood, and mouths. Later, like a promise I didn't make. He met me halfway down the block, like we were staging a reunion instead of an audit, palms out, voice already pitched to mercy, saying he did what any decent man would do when bills stack like snowdrifts and the power company forgets your name unless you spell it with cash. The grief memory hits first, the way my mother would tilt her head when he told a story, granting him extra daylight, the way she believed survival and goodness were Siamese twins, and for a breath I want to borrow her softness. Then the image of the pawnshop monitor cuts across my chest, the hooded posture I know like handwriting, and disbelief sours into the same cold anger that steadied my hands at Detective Morris's desk while he fanned receipts in a slow, devastating arc. I touch the hollow at my collarbone where the locket used to rest, as if a touch could conjure it, and I tell Greg we are not going to talk in metaphors. We are going to talk about dates and signatures, and the price you put on what my mother asked me to keep. He starts with the mortgage, a fright story dressed as confession. Numbers that sound urgent because they are round and large, a past due notice waved like a white flag. He mentions the gas bill, the late fee on the water, a payment plan that needs a good faith gesture. He says he hates asking me to understand because he knows how I loved her, which is the exact shape of a martyrdom that expects applause. I keep my voice level and ask him why the locket with my baby photo had to leave this house to keep a light bulb on. I ask why you pawn a bracelet twice in 1 month if the first sale was about emergency. I ask why last month, specifically, when the funeral glow had faded enough that neighbors stopped dropping off casseroles and started looking away. He exhales like an actor who knows the next scene is his big one and says Kara's name with reverence, calls her an angel who stepped in with cash and kindness when I pulled back, as if my return to work counted as retreat. He says Kara fronted money when the bank wouldn't, that she signed what the pawnshop needed because his hand shook too hard, that she believed in him when grief made me brittle. He wants me to understand how good people bend rules in bad seasons, and he wants the bending to look like courage. I think about the red pen circling his signature on Morris's table, the neat K. Renner below it on the slips where he needed a second hand to make the theft move faster. I think about the timestamps that didn't care about his tremor, and the intake lines that documented a pattern instead of a panic. Dates do not lie for you just because your narrative needs them to. So I tell him the Thursday, Tuesday, Friday cadence, the way the numbers step down as if shame were haggling with itself, and I watch his eyes go flat. He pivots, tries humor, calls the clerk overzealous, says audits are witch hunts, says I'm letting a detective poison family. He says family like a door he can still close on my foot. Investigative focus keeps me from kicking it. I tell him the hold will be placed in the morning, that the court will get an emergency inventory filed by noon with exhibits labeled and a judge's stamp before the auctioneer finishes his second coffee. I tell him I'm changing the locks because grief is not a permission slip to treat a house like a bank, and because my mother asked me to keep the family clean, And this is the bleaching no one writes songs about. My eyes drift, uninvited, to the mental picture of my printer roaring again, the pages warm against my palm, the receipt squared, the staples clenched like teeth. He notices and smiles like a man who thinks paperwork is theater rather than teeth. The proof shock is quiet, the way the truth sometimes is when it lands. He says he only went once, maybe twice, and I quote the 4 visits from the receipts, the time of day, the amounts, the clerk's initials, the CCTV timestamp. He says Kara handled details, and I ask if that's what he calls forging. He says he'll get everything back if I stop making it public. And I tell him sunlight is the only solvent I trust. I tell him any redemption fees will be paid. Any property recovered will be logged. Any argument he thinks he's winning will live or die on paper he doesn't control. Moral high ground is not louder, it's longer. Exhausted relief threads through the anger because saying it out loud organizes the fear into tasks. I tell him I'll email him a written notice about the locks and the hearing date, and for a second the smallest part of me hopes he will nod and retreat and let me drag this through the right channels without more theater. He steps closer instead, easy as muscle memory, and as if we rehearsed the gesture in kinder rooms, he reaches into the drawer by the entry table where I kept the spare keys for deliveries and neighbors and grieving widowers who needed to feel trusted. He palms the ring with a magician's speed and tucks it into his pocket like a souvenir. And when I say his name the way my mother did when she wanted him to stop being charming, he leans in so close I can see the red rim of his eyes and the tiny white fleck on his lower lip where nervous teeth have worried skin, and he lowers his voice as if that makes it merciful. "You won't make it to court if you keep digging," he says, and the keys knock against his thigh like punctuation. I went home shaking like a witness who knows the oath is coming, and I told the only machine in my life that never lies to start humming. The printer woke, the screen blinked ready, and I laid my mother's will beside the keyboard like a hand I could still hold while I translated loss into paragraphs that could stand up in court. The grief memory arrived first, the way she used to lean over my homework and say, "Make your argument and then make it prettier." And I almost laughed at the audacity of that voice inside a night like this. Disbelief tried one more weak flutter, a polite fiction whispering that maybe Greg would knock and apologize and undo it all. But the stack of receipts Detective Morris had fanned under fluorescent light kept unspooling in my head, dates marching like soldiers, signatures refusing to disguise themselves, and the flutter died. Cold anger moved in with purpose. I opened a new pleading, titled it in precise capitals, Verified Petition for Emergency Inventory and Temporary Restraining Order, and began feeding the page with the kind of detail liars hate because it leaves them no air. I wrote my mother's name with the honorific she earned, set out the jurisdiction, and described the house the way a land surveyor would, down to the closet where the velvet box nested, and the drawer where the spare keys used to live. No longer. I identified the property by name and history, the square-cut sapphire bracelet with a faint nick by the clasp, the gold locket with my infant photo on the left and her handwriting. For luck. On the right, the Depression-era coin set cataloged by mint and year, a lineage of metal that had outlasted 4 recessions and 1 marriage. I attached the exhibits in the order a judge's eye can follow without irritation. Exhibit A, the graduation photo where the bracelet shone against my wrist like conviction. Exhibit B, the appraisal with serial marks that turned sentiment into traceable fact. Exhibit C, the will clause, non-transferable keepsakes. A phrase my mother chose because she understood the law the way she understood recipes, precise and generous. Exhibit D, Detective Morris's stamped receipts, date and time inked in the corner where chain of custody becomes less a doctrine and more a seatbelt. Investigative focus made the room smaller and safer. I listed the pawnshop's address, the auction flyer's date, the intake log numbers the clerk let me photograph, the CCTV timestamp that caught posture like a fingerprint. I detailed the pattern, Thursday bracelet, Tuesday locket, Friday coins, so the court could feel the rhythm and call it what it was. Not emergency, but system. I explained the harm that couldn't be fixed with a check, because some losses are not priced. I asked the court to freeze disposition, to order immediate return upon proof, to require any purported buyer to hold in place until we could be heard. My eyes kept drifting to the printer as it pushed out each drafted page, warm sheets sliding into a neat drift that I squared with my palms the way Morris squared his, and the sound steadied me more than breathing did. Proof shock arrived not as a new blow, but as a brightening. When I inserted the photo of the locket nestled against my throat at 16, I remembered my mother fastening it with a tenderness that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with telling a girl she mattered. I tucked that memory under a caption line, plaintiff wearing subject locket, and felt the strange calm of a moral high ground built on labor rather than anger. I dialed my boss, voice lower than midnight deserves, and he answered on the second ring the way only litigators and surgeons do. I walked him through the receipts, the signatures, the auction clock, the safety risk of keys now gone, and he listened without interrupting until he said he'd file first thing, and that family cases burn even when you keep the flames on paper, so keep my hands clean and my mouth cleaner. I told him I would, then called the hospice. The night supervisor recognized Kara's name and confirmed she'd resigned last month, the week after my mother's service, the week the receipt showed the first sale. It felt like a door quietly closing somewhere down a hallway I hadn't meant to walk. I left Kara a voicemail. That was equal parts invitation and warning. Told her I had the dates and the signatures and the will, and that I wanted her side before the court drew its own conclusions. I asked her to call me back even if shame was louder than sense tonight. When I hung up, I touched the bare skin where the locket should be, a reflex as steady as a metronome, and wondered when touching absence had become my nervous tic. It was past 1 when the last page printed, the caption blocks a line, the exhibits clipped to their tabs like feathers pinned to history. Exhausted relief finally threaded through the room, not because anything was finished, but because the next hours were mapped. Scan, email, sleep on mom's couch with copies under the cushion like a shield against messy men and bad nights. I turned off the desk lamp and the house sighed the way old houses do when you promise them you're staying, even as the new locks on tomorrow's list said otherwise. I tucked the manila folder into a tote, slid the spare flash drive into the pocket where I used to keep lip balm, and lay down in the living room that still smelled faintly of her hand lotion and lemon oil, that clean American domestic normale I was fighting to reclaim. My phone vibrated against the coffee table, a small, insistent rattle that dragged me back upright. I thought it might be my boss with a note about the caption line, or the court's morning calendar. Maybe Kara with a confession she couldn't carry into daylight. I thumbed the screen awake, and the image opened so fast it felt like a slap. My bracelet on a stranger's wrist, skin I did not know under the sapphires I knew like my own name, and a caption typed with the breezy cruelty of people who deal in other people's sentiment. Bid starts Friday. They propped my mother's love open for strangers. The locket splayed like a book with its story ripped out. My baby photo swapped for stock art of a yellow rose, and the glass over it winked back my face as if to ask whether I still recognized the girl who promised to keep the family clean. The preview room was a climate-controlled hush that pretended respect while it priced history. Velvet trays lined the tables. Tags dangled from chains like little verdicts, and my grief moved through it with the clipped gait of someone trying to keep her balance on ice. I took the clipboard at the entrance and began the work that steadies me, cataloging what used to live in my mother's dresser as if I were logging evidence at the office. Lot 118, gold locket, oval, hinge at 2 o'clock, interior compromised, photo replaced. Lot 119, coin sleeve, mixed mints, dates broken out as separate sublots. Lot 120, sapphire bracelet, square cuts, clasp nick described in handwriting that didn't notice it mattered. Every number I wrote down steadied my hand and salted my tongue. The fee schedule posted by the glass case read like a petty tax on sentiment. Redemption percentage, storage fee, processing fee, a line called verification that sounded noble while it hurt. I copied it anyway, because thieves hate paper more than they hate shame, and because a judge's eye needs both injury and arithmetic. When the clerk frowned at me for standing too long with my phone near the case, I smiled the fixed smile women learn in rooms where authority relaxes only for men, and asked whether the preview allowed note-taking for possible redemption. He waved a hand, bored, and I kept writing. By the bidder registration table, a printed sheet lay face up, names reduced to initials like a secret no one believed in. Halfway down the page, I found KR, followed by a P.O. box and a cell phone number with the last 2 digits inked over. It took my brain 1 beat to accept what my eyes already knew. Kara had registered to bid on the afterlife of our house. I didn't trust my legs to carry that much betrayal, so I went still, touching my bare throat where the locket should have rested, the ghost of chain a metronome under my skin. The stack of receipts Morris fanned last night flashed across my vision, the rhythm of Thursday, Tuesday, Friday, until the dates lined up with this calendar, until the pattern started to feel less like coincidence and more like choreography. She arrived in scrubs, hair tucked behind one ear, face pale with the specific fatigue I learned in hospice hallways, and for a moment the grief memory cracked something soft open in me, despite what I knew. When she saw me, she stopped as if the floor had moved. "I shouldn't be here," she said before I could speak, and there was no melodrama in it, only fact. She swallowed, eyes landing on the locket as if she might apologize to the glass, and told me Greg had promised to repay her mother's lingering medical debt if she helped move things until insurance cleared. He'd called it temporary, called it compassionate, called it what men call it when they need a woman to believe they are better than their paperwork. I asked her why last month, why multiple pawns, why signatures on slips she knew weren't mine. She looked at the carpet and said some pieces were already off the grid, cash only, handed to a private buyer who said he wanted to keep them safe until the storm passed. The phrase triggered something technical in my head, the way certain words do, safe until storm, and I wrote both in the margin beside the lot numbers because euphemisms are often the best search terms. I asked for a name. She offered Colton, then shook her head as if she'd betrayed a confidant instead of a conspiracy. The auctioneer stepped onto a small riser near the front and tapped a microphone. The room's coil of whispers tensed into silence. He announced with the salesman's cheer I have always disliked that due to interest they'd be moving a few select lots to a tonight-only early sale window, a phrase that curled my stomach the way roller coasters do right before the drop. He read the numbers like random stars, then landed on mine. Lot 120, sapphire bracelet, tucked between a diamond tennis chain and a vintage watch, and the cold anger I'd kept neat broke its frame. I raised my hand and asked whether this deviated from the published schedule, whether holders had been notified in writing as the policy promised, and he gave me a shrug sharpened into a smile, the kind that says policy is a costume. Investigative focus returned like a belt pulled tight. I stepped to the counter, recorded the updated board where someone had written tonight's lots in squeaky marker, and added the notation to my makeshift inventory. I asked whether redemption remained possible pending verification, and the clerk answered yes in the technical sense, and no in the way that mattered if the bracelet crossed into cash under a different receipt by dusk. Proof shock landed in a subtler place this time. The intake photo of my bracelet beneath the glass included a corner of a newspaper with yesterday's date, which meant the item had turned over faster than even their own paperwork planned, and someone had hustled it there. The moral high ground is boring work at speed. I handed the clerk my card, stated clearly that I intended to redeem upon proof, and that any deviation would be presented to a judge first thing, and I felt the exhausted relief that comes from having exactly one path through a burning room and taking it. Behind me, Kara whispered that she was sorry, and that sorry always arrives too late, and I didn't disagree. The clerk leaned closer as if the glass had ears and dropped his voice to confessional. "Buyer wants to meet you," he said, eyes sliding toward the door. "He says he's keeping the coins safe." The diner light was the same jaundiced yellow as the auction room, but it felt cleaner because the napkin under Detective Morris's hand turned into a whiteboard the second he uncapped his pen and drew a triangle so simple even grief had to listen. Greg at the top point, Kara on the left, an empty right corner waiting like a trap, with a name I didn't know yet. He set the receipts between us, and the paper made that papery hush I hear now in my sleep, an echo of last night's fluorescent ritual when he'd fanned dates and signatures until denial had no place to sit. I touched my bare throat where the locket should rest and forced the familiar rhythm of work to come back, because if you can name the corners, you can measure the angles, and if you can measure the angles, you can prove the thing that wants to be called a misunderstanding is in fact a design. He slid over bank printouts he'd pulled that morning on a consent form he'd coaxed from Greg during a routine welfare check, and the line items walked in lockstep with the pawn slips, ATM withdrawals within minutes of each transaction, deposits into a betting app flagged to the same debit card, losses spiking on the nights he told me. The mortgage monster had knocked again, which reframed the entire story from emergency to appetite. Morris tapped the napkin, wrote in tight letters along each edge the words motive, means, opportunity, and then, because he knows how to talk to the part of me that files instead of wails, he listed potential charges like a grocery order. Theft by conversion for turning entrusted property into quick cash, fraud if he sweetened his story with false statements to induce signatures, forgery where my name or rights should have appeared and did not. And the relief that crept in wasn't joy, it was the dignity of a vocabulary that fit what I had seen with my own untrusting eyes. I watched his pen hover at the empty corner and asked him to write buyer without quotation marks. He nodded, wrote it, then added a name beneath in careful block script. Colton Pierce, Boutique Estate Service, downtown office with frosted glass and a website that promises discretion. We parceled the day like a shared mission, the way nurses used to plot my mother's meds on a whiteboard. I would wire the redemption fee for the locket the second the clerk opened and email the confirmation to both the shop and my boss, so the chain of intent would be timed and dated on 3 devices, while he would fax. Yes, still fax because old systems embarrass modern thieves. An investigative hold requesting that the bracelet remain under verification review pending proof submissions, a polite way of saying hands off without tipping our entire hand. I would file in small claims before lunch, a parallel action to force Greg into daylight under oath about disposition and possession, not because the dollar amount captured the harm, but because the process granted me a hearing date and a summons he couldn't ignore without consequence. I would serve him in public where his charm performs worst, and I would do it with a witness the way a woman learns to walk to her car with a friend after midnight. He pushed coffee my way, black and hot and honest, and slid a photocopy of the auction's fee schedule under my palm, as if to remind me that commerce was the costume of this particular sin. I let my eyes drift to the printer behind the counter, listening to it cough out receipts for omelets and pie, and thought of my own machine humming back home, the motion drafted, the exhibits clipped, the caption lines straight and small and stubborn. Proof shocks had started arriving like rain instead of thunder, but they still soaked. Morris showed me a crosstab he'd built. Pawn times, ATM withdrawals, betting deposits, losses, and the line circling that triangle grew tight enough to make me dizzy. I called the pawn shop from the booth, identified myself, and announced into the clerk's indifference that a wire would hit shortly to freeze the locket upon proof. I sent my boss the payment confirmation and the draft petition as a courtesy and a shield, and he replied with the kind of thumbs up spelled in words that counts in court. Received at 9:02 a.m., filing by 9:30, keep your phone on. The moral high ground felt less like a sermon and more like carpentry. Measure twice, cut once, don't let anyone rush you into crooked work. Kara's name hovered like a bruise on the napkin's left corner. I told Morris about the bidder list initial and the P.O. box, about her confession scripted in apology and debt, and he wrote pressure by her point because he is generous and still accurate. The door chimed, and a rush of cold air knifed through the sugar smell. The waitress looked up, then away, and I recognized the choreography of places where men with money practice intimacy on rooms that cannot answer back. He was younger than I'd imagined, or maybe just better preserved, tidy in the curated way people get when they decide presentation is a profession. He carried a clear archival sleeve the size of a dinner plate, and even before he reached our booth, the coin set inside winked like rescued stars. Grief memory hit me hard enough to make my fingers find my throat again. Disbelief danced one last dainty step as if the universe might be returning something because I had learned my lesson swiftly and well. Cold anger sat the two of them down and told them to behave while the adult spoke. Morris didn't stand and didn't smile. He slid the napkin aside, made space for the object to land, and kept his pen in his hand like punctuation waiting for its sentence. The man stopped at the table, eyes warm with a professional empathy that smelled faintly of cologne and branding, and angled the sleeve so the coins caught the light as if this were a stage and we were the grateful audience. I kept my gaze on the serials typed on the edge, saw the mint dates that belonged to my lineage like freckles belong to a face, and felt exhausted relief clang against my ribs alongside the warning bells that never, ever stop once you have heard them in time. He smiled without showing teeth and said, "I bought these to protect you." He sat like a polished ally in a suit that photographed well. The coin set angled between us as if kindness were a product line, and I felt that old grief memory wash through me. The coins in my mother's palm on Sundays, her thumb rubbing dates like prayers. Before the room remembered itself, and the business card on the table reminded me that tenderness sometimes invoices by the hour. He introduced himself in a tone designed to calm skittish sellers, said he specialized in estate rescue, and called my situation delicate, which is how predators spell opportunity without using the word. I touched the bare notch at my collarbone where the locket should rest, a reflex I can't kill, and let disbelief give me its last small mercy, imagining briefly that he'd simply return what was mine because the story offended him, before cold anger did what it always does and set the table with facts. He slid a glossy folder across the booth. Inside, a proposal bloomed in serif fonts. He'd released the coin set to me at his cost, plus a finder's fee, an amount written so elegantly it took a second to register as a bruise. He framed it as compassion. He framed everything as compassion. Detective Morris didn't bother to disguise the dryness in his voice when he asked to see the bill of sale, and Colton produced it with a neatness that tried to pass for transparency. The paper smelled faintly of toner, and the ink still shone where the signature bled. G. Hale wobbled at the baseline with the telltale tremor of someone trying to be someone else, and my mother's name on the upper line made my eyes sting in a way that wasn't theatrical. The stack of receipts Morris had fanned last night materialized in my head, the cadence of dates, the red circles around signatures, and the comparison clicked into place like a safety on a weapon, the same penstroke habits, the same fast and loose approach to identity when money wanted company. Colton narrated the forgery as misunderstanding, the way charming men do when they sense a woman has a vocabulary and a witness. He implied Greg told him I'd prefer a quiet liquidation to avoid the spectacle of court, and the phrasing was so exact it felt rehearsed. I pictured my printer back home spitting out the motion to preserve and felt steadier than I sounded. Quiet is the luxury of people who didn't lose anything. I asked Colton whether his boutique compassion came with compliance manuals or just scented candles. Morris photographed the bill of sale, the archival sleeve, the serials typed along the edge. His hands moved with the efficiency that comes from having wanted to catch a lie for longer than a decade. He warned Colton, not lazily but precisely, that receiving stolen property is a charge that doesn't disappear under linen napkins, and that good intentions make poor exhibits. Colton didn't flinch, but his grin relaxed a degree, the way salesmen smile when they sense the meeting will run long. "I'm trying to help her," he said, eyes drifting to me for corroboration that wasn't coming. "And I've advanced considerable funds to make sure these weren't melted down." The word melted made my stomach tilt. The image of those coins as slag burned like a fever and then cooled into a steadier heat. Investigative focus stepped between us. I asked for provenance, original intake documents, chain of custody from the moment the coin set left my house under a lie to the instant it landed in his curated hands, proof of cash paths that didn't leak into Greg's betting account like rain into a bucket. I asked for the appraisal he surely commissioned before risking capital, the notes his associate must have taken when G. Hale failed to produce identification that matched the signature. He hedged, then softened, then hedged again in a choreography so familiar it belongs in an HR manual, murmuring about client confidentiality, about privacy, about how women in my position often appreciate discretion. I told him discretion is just a dimmer switch for men who don't like their names read into the record. Proof shock arrived not as a shout, but as a whisper from the paper itself. In the margin of his invoice packet, a handwritten note curved like a quiet boast. "Hold coin set until Friday. Auction interest escalating." And Friday was the day the preview board had promised an early sale. He was midwifing my grief into better margins. I placed my palm flat on the folder and said that if his goal was to keep anything safe, he'd welcome a subpoena to sanctify his intent, and that I had no objection to paying lawful costs once a judge blessed the path the metal had taken from my mother's drawer to his manicured hand. Moral high ground isn't theater, it's procedure at speed. Morris nodded once, small and approving, and asked Colton to email PDFs of all documents within the hour, so we don't have to test everyone's memory later. The booth felt too hot, the coffee too sweet. Exhausted relief floated up in strange places, at the sight of the serials that matched my appraisal, at the knowledge that I wasn't alone at this table, at the clarity that comes when a man finally says the number he wants and you know exactly what you won't give. Colton tapped the archival sleeve, reminding me that metal endures, as if that were argument enough to pay the toll he'd built from my mother's name. I told him endurance isn't permission. I told him the court was already moving. His phone lit on the vinyl between us. Face up, because men like him assume you'll watch and be impressed. A message preview slid across the glass, familiar punctuation catching the back of my throat even before my brain formed the words. Greg. She won't go through with court. Watch. The courtroom breathed like a library that knew secrets, varnish and paper and the salt of anxious skin. And when the clerk called my case, I felt the same grief memory that visited at dawn, my mother's hand steadying mine over a signature, before the room's formality cinched me upright and reminded me that today my voice would live on the record where lies go to fail. I had watched my printer spit out these pages in the dim lamplight, exhibits stacked square and clipped so tight the metal teeth bit my thumb. Now those same exhibits rode the cart to counsel table in transparent sleeves, and the familiar weight steadied doubt the way a bailiff's posture steadies a room. Disbelief fluttered at the edges like a moth that hadn't learned the lamp burns, whispering maybe Greg would fold, maybe he would apologize. But the stack of receipts Detective Morris had fanned under fluorescence last night scrolled like a news ticker behind my eyes, and the flutter died on cue. I touched the bare notch where the locket should rest, a reflex I can't break, and rose when the judge looked down the bench and found me. I began with what I could swear to without shaking. The box and its hollow velvet, the pawn stub curled like a secret, the timeline that matched the clerk's intake, and the camera's indifferent eye. I offered the will clause, non-transferable keepsakes, as Exhibit C, and the appraisal as Exhibit B, and the graduation photo where the sapphire bracelet hugged my wrist like a promise my mother had fastened herself. The investigative focus that had carried me through drafting returned as cadence. I walked the court through Thursday, Tuesday, Friday like I was teaching a rhythm section to hit on the 4, and I laid the auction schedule on the lectern so the date stamped in bold could glare back at anyone who pretended we were not already sprinting. Greg's attorney smiled the way professionals do when they intend to call a bruise a misunderstanding. He said the words family matter like a shop blanket thrown over a bright engine. He called the sale's mistimed liquidation to cover essentials, tried to sweeten the forged signature on Colton's bill of sale with the suggestion of a trembling hand and good intentions. Cold anger did its quiet work. I watched the judge's eyes stop blinking while counsel spoke, a tell I have learned to love, and then the judge did what I had hoped someone with a robe and a gavel would finally do out loud. He read the pattern back to the room in a voice without embroidery, dates, amounts, signatures, withdrawals, deposits into a betting app that had never once paid a power bill. Proof shock arrived as the judge's summary turned into an order drafted aloud. He restrains further transfers pending hearing on the merits. He directs immediate return of identified property within 10 days upon proof of ownership. He authorizes police assist to avoid self-help confrontations. And I swallowed the laugh that wanted to escape at the phrase, because if last night counted as anything, it was a rehearsal for just that. He notes the forged signature with a clipped frown and glances at the counsel table where Colton's card sits like a prop that didn't earn its stage time. Kara's affidavit slid into evidence with a soft scrape of plastic. In neat block letters, she admitted signing slips, believing Greg when he told her I had approved, and the judge's attention pivoted like a compass needle. Pressure away from the nurse who believed, and toward the man who arranged her belief like furniture. The room shifted, even the gallery's coughs changed timbre, as if strangers had recalibrated a line between mistake and design. The bailiff passed me a tissue with a professionalism that pretended he hadn't seen tears before. I didn't use it. I let the air dry my eyes because I wanted the record to reflect steadiness. The moral high ground never feels holy when you're standing on it. It feels like paperwork and posture and the refusal to let your voice pitch even when the person you once set a place for tries to look small. Outside, cameras blinked like metallic insects as the hallway filled with a whispery energy that makes regular people talk too loud. I kept my press statement minimal and measured, one sentence built from nouns that can bear weight. I'm grateful the court recognized the pattern, and I'm focused on retrieving my mother's property through lawful channels. Someone asked if I blamed the hospice nurse. I said no. Someone asked if I wanted jail. I said I wanted the truth to cost what it costs. Exhausted relief floated up as the elevator dinged, and the doors opened on a brief space with stale air and a merciful absence of microphones. I had 10 days and a police assist, and the judge's words heavy as proof in my bag. The coin set's serials, the locket's hinge, the bracelet's nick felt less like lost children and more like coordinates I could navigate toward. The printer would work again tonight, my boss would file again tomorrow, and the triangle Morris drew on a napkin now wore labels none of us could pretend were guesses. I stepped into the hall to breathe and felt the shift in air before I saw him. Greg had a talent for finding the places where authority thins, the liminal spots between elevators and stairwells, the quiet corners by water fountains, and he moved into my path with the same soft-footed confidence he used to have in the kitchen, carrying a paper grocery bag like benign camouflage. He smelled like wintergreen gum and impatience. He didn't speak until we stood close enough that I could see the red shelf of skin where a razor had skimmed too fast, the nervous nick that says a man got ready for a fight with shaky hands. He pressed a cold key into my palm and curled my fingers around it, voice low and almost sweet. Come alone if you want the bracelet back. The hallway hummed with the cheap fluorescence of places built to forget, concrete sweating a little, bleach sharp in the back of my throat, and every padlock I passed felt like a throat clearing before a lie. Ambush lives in corridors like this, where evidence comes to disappear and cowards practice magic tricks with other people's history. I texted Morris the address and the unit number before I touched the roll-up door, thumbs steady the way training makes them, then set my phone to record and said the time and date out loud because the record loves a timestamp almost as much as thieves hate one. The key Greg had pressed into my palm turned once, grudgingly, and the metal door jumped in its rails like it didn't want to know what it was about to show me. Inside smelled like fresh paint over an old story. Gray concrete, a single caged bulb buzzing, and a neat row of plastic tubs stacked 2 by 2 with masking tape labels that tried to sound innocent. Kitchen, linen, photos, keepsakes. The word felt obscene in this light. Grief memory knocked me back a half step before I let it in. I saw my mother at the stove with her recipe cards fanned like a poker hand, flour on her knuckles, locket catching the under cabinet light. I felt my own fingers reach for the empty notch at my collarbone where that chain should rest, then come down to the zipper of the first tub. Inside lay her handwriting in a rubber-banded stack, the gravy stains on the Thanksgiving card perfectly round as if time could be archived too. Beneath them, a folded receipt stamped in red, redeemed, over the words gold locket. The clerk's initials the same tidy pair I'd photographed at the pawn counter. Disbelief offered its last weak bargain. Maybe this means he brought it back, and died when I lifted the paper and saw the redemption date was yesterday, hours after the judge's order, a move designed to look like compliance while it broke the spirit of it. Cold anger made my hands precise. I narrated everything into the phone. Label, contents, stamp, condition, because chain of custody loves sentences more than outrage. Footsteps slapped concrete outside, the rhythm of people who intend to be first to their own defense, and Greg's voice carried before he rounded the corner, smooth as always, Kara half a pace behind him in scrubs that looked like pennants. He opened his arms like a host greeting guests to a surprise party and started on the speech about how he'd meant to call me, how the storage was temporary, how the locket receipt proved good faith. Morris stepped from the shadow of Unit 212 with another officer, the court's order in his hand, and a weariness in his posture that meant he'd seen this theater before. He read the restraining language cleanly. No transfers, immediate return upon proof, police assist authorized, and the paper between his fingers made the same papery hush it had on the diner table. That sound I now hear as a promise. Kara's eyes found mine and skittered away. Greg's went straight to the tubs like a gambler cutting a deck he swears isn't marked. I asked for the bracelet. I didn't pad it with pleasantries. The syllables clicked like steel because I'm done translating. Greg's mouth did the little sympathetic downturn it learned the night my mother died, and he said it was gone, said he'd been about to call, said a jumble of soft words that didn't touch the hard facts sitting to his left. A black duffel slumped against the wall like a tired animal. His eyes cut to it and back before his mouth could finish the sentence. an involuntary confession. Investigative focus moved first. I pointed, asked Morris to note the bag, then knelt and pulled the zipper with the same care I use on exhibit envelopes. Inside were the paper bones of his story, pawn slips ragged at the corners, betting receipts printed on thin heat rolls, a cheap heat sealer with a scuff on its handle, and a velvet pouch that tried for elegance and failed. Proof shock is sometimes tactile. The feel of that pouch in my hand sent a current through my arm, the body recognizing the shape and weight before the mind organizes the dread. I described it for the recording, set it on the floor where the caged bulb could do its little indifferent job, and loosened the tie. What lay inside at first glance could have fooled a woman who wanted peace more than accuracy. Square-cut sapphires, clasp shining, weight comforting in the palm. My mother's bracelet, the story wanted to say, returned by a repentant man in a concrete chapel of caution. But the skin knows what the eye would forgive. The clasp edges were too clean. The tiny nick near the hinge I knew like a freckle on my own cheek was missing, the prongs a hair too high, the shimmer and imitation's eager brightness, instead of the older light a real stone throws when it remembers wrists and rooms and years. Moral high ground is not volume, it is articulation under pressure. I kept my voice even as I lifted a piece toward the bulb and narrated differences into the lens. No micro-engraving on the underside, prong count slightly off, clasp mechanism too stiff, stone's uniform where original cuts showed the tiny variance a human hand leaves. Morris angled his body cam to catch my demonstration, professional and patient, a man used to letting truth assemble itself frame by frame rather than by proclamation. Kara's breath hitched, Greg's did not. Exhausted relief rose like a weak tide because the path was still the path. The replica would live in an evidence bag with the duffel's paper. The receipt marked redeemed would be an exhibit against the good faith story. The tubs would be inventoried by the book, and the unit's lock would click shut under police seal while a judge's name still vibrated in the air. I could see my printer at home in my mind. Trays full, light steady, ready to push this night into the record where bleach can't reach. Greg leaned against the wall and watched me hold his stage prop like I was auditioning for a role he'd written for me, the patient woman who mistakes a costume for a return. He smirked, chin tilting, as if we were the only two people in the room who mattered. "Prove the difference," he said, and the replica caught the light like a lie learning its lines. Evidence beats theater when you can make a room see the difference between a prop and a life, and I learned to do that at a conference table under fluorescent light long before the storage hallway smelled like bleach and endings. I steadied the fake bracelet beneath the cage bulb and let grief do its brief, aching pass across my ribs, the flash of my mother hooking the clasp before graduation, her thumb sweeping past a tiny scratch near the hinge like a blessing. And then I pulled the past into the present the way a paralegal does when memory needs paperwork. From my tote, I drew the appraisal in its plastic sleeve, the page my mother insisted we keep updated because love deserves receipts. And I set it on a flattened box lid as an impromptu desk. Next came the photo, me in a blue dress, tassel crooked, her hand at my shoulder, the sapphire circle blazing like a private joke. And if you zoomed in, here, I told him, leaning close, you could see the little crescent scratch at the clasp, a bite so specific you could find it in a lineup. Morris crouched to my level so his body cam could drink the details. I read the serial engraving from the appraisal aloud, and then rotated the replica to show the mismatch, the font a hair too modern, the dash spacing wrong, the absence of the jeweler's barely their hallmark. The room changed when the paperwork spoke. Even the bulb's buzz seemed to drop a pitch. The stack of receipts he'd fanned across that diner table flashed in my head, a chorus behind today's solo, and I felt disbelief, for once, not at what a man had done, but at how cleanly the record corrected him. Kara's breath snagged and stayed. She pressed her fingers to her mouth like she could push the truth back in, then let them fall and stared at the pouch with something like nausea. Her voice arrived small and steady, apology stripped of ornament, and she said Greg swapped the bracelet the day before the preview, said he told her real stones invited thieves, while placeholders discouraged them, said he had the real one, safe with a friend, until the auction drama passed. The friend had a name she hated saying out loud, Colton, and collateral was the word that finally dissolved whatever loyalty she had soldered to a promise of debt relief. I touched the hollow at my collarbone where the locket should rest and didn't rescue her from the silence. She rescued herself. I'll cooperate, she added, eyes on the appraisal, as if asking the paper for permission. Morris had already texted the order an hour ago, the judge's signature a clean black ribbon across the bottom, and when footsteps echoed at the end of the corridor, the sound carried the expensive confidence I'd first heard in the diner. Colton entered like a man who trusts lighting, immaculate as before, a fireproof safe pouch tucked under his arm, and a look calibrated for concern. He clocked the uniforms, read the tone of the room swift as a weatherman, and when Morris lifted the order in 2 fingers, no lecture, no threat, just authority held level, Colton pivoted smoothly from protector to compliant custodian. He set the pouch on the box lid beside the appraisal as if placing a reliquary on an altar, and he said, I'm relieved truly, with such practiced warmth that the bulb hummed in agreement. Investigative focus made my hands ceremonial. I named the time for the recorder, sliced the pouch seal where its tamper strip requested, and drew out a velvet roll that had the right weight before it had the right colors. The bracelet lay there like a slow sunrise, sapphires throwing their old light, metal softened by years of wrists, man-made scratches dancing alongside. The one scratch that meant home. And when I rotated the clasp toward the lens, the little crescent winked like a conspirator finally heard. Proof shock landed in my knees. I didn't sway. We read the serials twice, then a third time because the heart wants ceremony where the law wants certainty. Match, match, match. Morris narrated chain of custody as he logged it. Bracelet from Colton Pierce pursuant to Order 14B. Condition noted. Serial verified against Exhibit B. Temporary custody to evidence locker pending return upon property receipt. Witness signatures to follow. He handed me the coin set a beat later, also safe-pouched, the mint dates like a line of ancestors waiting to sign in, and for the first time since opening the empty box at 7:58 p.m., exhausted relief rose in my chest without barbs. Not triumph, alignment. Greg moved the way a cornered thought does, fast and not smart. He lunged for the coins before I could sign, a jagged surge that made the bulb swing and Kara cry out, and the officers closed the space with a choreography that said this moment had been rehearsed by worse men than him. The clatter of cuffs against his wrists sounded both louder and smaller than I'd imagined, like a broken zipper, and still he tried to curate the narrative with his mouth, listing bills, listing intentions, listing fictions that had all died under fluorescent light. Kara looked at me then, not for absolution but for instructions, and I gave her the only ones I had. Tell the whole truth, write it down, sign it in ink you can live with. She nodded, wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand like a practical girl late for work, and told Morris she'd start with the day Greg handed her the replica and asked her to stage the case. The moral high ground doesn't gloat, it documents. We documented until the air tasted less like bleach and more like paper. They walked Greg toward the door, chain taut, voice still reaching for a stage, and as he passed me he twisted enough that I could see the bright spot of a nick on his jaw, the human proof that even small blades draw blood when you shave too fast for truth. He smiled, but it missed his eyes, and he bent his head toward me with the intimacy of a kitchen whisper. You think this ends with jewelry? He said, laugh scraping the words thin. Check your mother's bank. The numbers told the truth my mouth could barely shape, and when the bank records opened like a second obituary, columns of pre-funeral transfers draining my mother's account into betting apps and a shell LLC with Colton's tasteful fingerprints, I felt the grief memory fold inside out, not softer, just honest. Morris slid the statements across the table the way a surgeon passes instruments, no flourish, only need. Routing numbers marched, amounts bled, authorization codes stacked like bad habits that finally signed their names. The earliest transfer dated the week she moved from the hospital to hospice. The largest slid out the morning I argued with Greg about whether to sell her car, and seeing those timestamps right over my memories with a pen that didn't flinch made disbelief stagger and sit down. Cold anger reached for its coat and stayed instead, because fury that doesn't do work curdles, and the work here was arithmetic so unromantic it became holy. I touched the notch above my collarbone where the locket should rest, and let my eyes settle on the printer in the corner, the old office model that burred and sighed and then did what it was born to do. Morris printed every transaction, lined them by date, then stapled the final stack with a fist press that made the metal teeth seat with a satisfying bite. I lifted the bundle and felt the strange weight of paper that has finally decided to be metal. The order came down at the next hearing with a crispness I have learned to trust, restitution based on withdrawals and valuations, a schedule mapped into months, not because leniency was earned, but because victims who get relief eventually still need groceries meanwhile. Kara took a plea that fit the shape of her confession: cooperation for leniency, an affidavit that tracked dates, a quiet promise to testify clear even if her hands shook. Colton's counsel tried to swaddle receiving in velvet phrases about preservation and discretion. The charges still landed, and watching a man who advertises safekeeping explain how he came to hold my mother's history in escrow taught me more about irony than any book. The triangle on Morris's napkin turned into a case caption with a docket number that would live on longer than any apology. I retrieved the locket and the bracelet the way conservators retrieve a painting, as evidence first, affection later. The property receipt crinkled as I signed, chain of custody initials bracketing my name like bodyguards, and when the officer handed me the small evidence bag, I didn't put the locket on. I slid both pieces into our home safe and labeled the envelope cleanly because memory deserves to be clean even when the metal has been handled by men who confuse sentiment with liquidity. On the drive home, traffic moved like a procession without grief, and I realized justice had changed the way my lungs worked. They didn't expect the door to slam while they were still inside the room. The scholarship idea arrived at my kitchen table where the printer still smelled faintly warm, and it felt less like charity than repair. Hospice had sent a thank you card 3 weeks after the funeral, with a line about how my mother always complimented the nurses' sneakers, and I heard her voice teasing me to spend money where people stand all day. I set up a fund under her name for AIDS continuing education and first pairs of shoes, wrote the mission statement without adjectives, and deposited the first check made of restitution dollars, because if debt is going to have a life in this story, then so is grace. When I emailed the director, I kept it minimal. For whoever is next. The reply came back with more punctuation than I knew what to do with. I took a deep breath and didn't correct it. At work, the partners called me into the conference room with the good coffee and offered a position on the investigations team, a promotion that wasn't a ribbon so much as a tool. I said yes before they finished the second sentence. I packed boxes from the house with the sad efficiency that grief makes you learn, and when I turned in the keys, I didn't look back. The peonies in the yard were already tilting toward a season that didn't require my consent. I moved into an apartment with light that made honest shadows. The first night there, I set the printer on a low table and the manila folders on a high shelf because I needed the reminder that the work is mine, but the record has my back. Proof shock still arrives, but it no longer knocks me flat. It takes a seat and waits while I decide what to do. The moral high ground has become a routine rather than a mountaintop. Read, log, confirm, act. Exhausted relief comes predictably now, at the end of days that require it, and I have stopped mistaking exhaustion for weakness. To the people watching who have followed every ugly detail, I want to ask you something plain. The way my mother would. What would you have done the first time you smelled the lie? Would you have named it, written it down, signed it, or would you have forgiven the story because it wore the clothes of a bill you recognized? I placed the last box in the hall and sat at the table where everything began to change. The printer's fan cutting off like a sigh, the stapled stack of transactions occupying a neat square of wood like a boundary I can finally see. That's when the courier buzzed. He handed me a single envelope. No return address, the kind of stationery that pretends not to matter. The slip inside was thin and familiar, perforation rough along one edge, the pawnshop logo peeking like a smirk. The date stamped in the week before my mother died. Item, wedding ring. No description, just a bare noun, signed in a hand that was neither Greg's nor Kara's, nor any version of my own. I held the paper where the light could make it confess and read the signature again, as if repetition could change ink into mercy, and knew the story had one more room I hadn't opened yet. If these were your mother's heirlooms, what would you do the first time you smelled the lie? Call the police or the court, drop one sentence you'd send to someone hiding behind family emergency, and share this with one person who needs to start a paper trail today. Want the follow-up on the mysterious wedding ring slip? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Comment receipts if you watch to the end. I'm pinning the sharpest advice.